Bill was down to his bare feet, and he had already lost his shirt. Shoes and socks were the first casualties of the game, and since neither of the girls were wearing socks, he thought they would be even fairly quickly. But Brenda and Alice had managed to stay ahead. Now the tide of the game had turned, and things were starting to get interesting. Brenda had lost her shorts on her last turn, and now she rolled the dice and moved her game token across the board. Bill saw she was going to land on one of his properties again. "Hello!" he grinned. Brenda scowled.
"Worst run of bad luck since Richard Nixon."
She pulled her shirt off. She had a pretty pink bra underneath, the sheer kind with demi-cups that exposed most of her breasts and left practically nothing to the imagination. It matched her pink bikini panties. Poor Ned, Bill thought. Look what you're missing. Well, that's what happens when you leave the party early. He smiled at Brenda as she dropped her shirt on the floor beside her chair. "Well, you can always call it quits if you want to," he said, making it a challenge.
"Fat chance,"
countered Brenda, as Alice reached for the dice.
"You're 2 steps from Pacific Avenue and Skin City."
"Ooh," said Bill, in mock fright. He thought of Steve Christie coming back from town and walking in on them playing Monopoly, stark naked. The thought of the expression on Steve's face almost made him choke on his beer.
"Whoops,"
said Alice, as she landed on one of Bill's streets. Brenda laughed. "Well, what can I say?" Bill said, with an elaborate shrug. "It's not much, but I call it home." He watched appreciatively as Alice started to unbutton her blouse. A sharp gust of wind suddenly blew the door in. Alice gave a little scream as the door flew open and slammed against the inside wall. A brief burst of rain blew into the room. Alice grabbed for the flying play money as Bill jumped up to shut the door. "I'll get it, I'll get it."
"Wait a minute,"
Brenda shouted, laughing.
"Grab the money." "Oh my God!"
screamed Alice. Bill forced the door closed against the wind. The game was a shambles. Play money and game tokens and deed cards had flown all over the place. "It's blowing like crazy out there," Bill said.
"Oh, and I think I left the windows of my cabin open,"
Brenda realized.
"Shoot."
Alice rolled her eyes. Brenda grabbed her slicker and threw it over her shoulders, then bent down to pick up her clothes.
"Well, we're going to have to finish this game some other night," she said, just when it was getting interesting.
"Okay," said Alice, feeling secretly relieved. She started to help Bill pick up the pieces of the game.
"See you guys in the morning,"
Brenda said, heading toward the door. "See ya," Bill said.
"Night,"
said Alice. Another brief gust of wind whistled through the room as Brenda opened the door and quickly shut it behind her. Alice sighed.
"Look at this mess."
She picked up the empty beer bottles and handed them to Bill.
"Here."
He took them from her, and she picked up the rest of the empties and went back into the kitchen with him. "Hey, tell me," Bill said. "Were you really going to go ahead with it?" Alice smiled.
"Actually, I hadn't made up my mind."
"Oh, well, in that case, we'll have to finish the game another night."
"Oh, yeah?"
She gave him a playful kick, and he ducked out of the way, chuckling. She watched him, wondering what would have happened if the wind hadn't blown the game all over the floor. What would Steve had said if he came back and walked in on them after a few more turns? And would they still be playing Monopoly? Maybe a lot could happen in a week, she thought, and the night wasn't over yet. Steve Christie sat hunched over his coffee at the counter in the general store. It had been a long day, running herd on the counselors, trying to get everything organized, and he was sick and tired of constantly running back into town because he had forgotten something. He had wanted to make sure this would be the last trip. He didn't particularly enjoy coming into town and picking up supplies. Not that anyone gave him a hard time, but there was an edge to the way they all behaved around him. They looked at him strangely. They didn't have to say a thing. Their eyes did all the talking. Sandy was the only one who didn't look at him as if he were his father's ghost. He had lingered at the counter, enjoying a hot dinner, munching a hot slice of apple pie, and nursing his coffee, much as he used to linger over Cokes and ice cream sodas at this same counter when he was a kid, and a much younger Sandy used to flirt with him, making him feel older. She always had a smile and a friendly word or two, and if she ever said anything about the camp, she didn't talk about it in his presence. She seemed to understand that it was a sore point with him, and that this was something he needed to do, if for no other reason than to prove everyone wrong about Camp Crystal Lake and his father. "I'll make a go of that damn place," he thought. "I'll make a go of it and show them what a bunch of superstitious nonsense all this stuff about camp blood is. I'll show them they were wrong about it, just like they were wrong about my father, a man whose only curse was an incredibly pathetic run of the worst luck in the world. And it would serve them right if I sold the goddamned place for a healthy profit to some real estate developer who'd come in and put up condos." He grimaced. That did not seem very likely, although Alice thought it could happen. "Lakefront property," she'd said. "How can lakefront property be worthless?" He'd wanted to tell her the real reason. Instead, what he had told her was that it can be worthless if it's in an area that's economically depressed. Small towns were dying all over the country. No jobs. The agriculture industry was going down the tubes, with banks foreclosing on small farms and small town businesses being bled dry as they lost their customers. It would take a lot more to turn things around than an occasional rock concert or music video to benefit the farmer. Every domestic industry was being affected as the country shifted more and more to service industries and moved away from production, unable to compete with cheaper goods and labor from abroad. There had to be production. People had to get back to working with their hands. They had to have faith in themselves, in their own abilities, in the American spirit. Even the Japanese were saying that. People were buying Japanese cars because they thought they were better than American cars, that the Japanese had better production and better quality control. But even the Japanese admitted that they had learned it from America. He could remember a time when nobody would even touch anything if it said "Made in Japan." That had changed because the Japanese people had made a commitment to changing it. They had worked hard. He had always made a point of reading about people who had started successful companies, about their beginnings. You learned how to be successful by studying successful people. Soichiro Honda had started with a small repair shop in Hamamutsu in 1928 and built it up into a factory producing piston rings, a factory that was bombed to smithereens during the war. But he hadn't given up. After the war, he started all over again, founding the Honda Technical Research Institute. It was an impressive-sounding name, but the institute had actually been only a wooden shed measuring 18 by 12 feet. Honda had bought 500 Army surplus engines, hired a few workers, and stuck the engines into bicycles, connecting them to the rear wheels with a drive belt. They ran on a mixture of gasoline and turpentine, and smoked like a plugged-up chimney. Not much of a beginning, but look where the Honda Corporation was today. And look at Chrysler, he thought. Look at any company where the people really cared about what they were doing, and you'd see that you can turn anything around if you're willing to work at it. Compared to some of those stories, a rundown summer camp was a joke. But then, an 18 by 12-foot wooden shed that was supposed to be a research institute was a joke as well. Sure, he could have taken the easy way out. He could have put the place up for sale, as run down as it was, and cut his losses, as Alice had suggested. Alice simply didn't understand his dreams. She couldn't appreciate the long view. She didn't even understand the most basic elements of business. Lakefront property, to her, naturally meant it wasn't worthless. Never mind that it was in a depressed area. Never mind it was falling apart from neglect. Never mind that it had been plagued by bad luck, starting with a boy drowning back in 1957 and 2 counselors being brutally murdered in 1958, and fires set by some arsonist the year after that, and one thing after another ever since, so that people now believed the place was cursed. He had wanted to tell her the place was worthless because people believed in the curse upon it and upon his family. They thought he was crazy to reopen the camp, to drop $25,000 of his own money to refurbish it and bring in inner-city kids. Everyone in town thought drunken old Ralph was crazy, with his talk about death curses and the Lord's vengeance. But were they really any better? At least Ralph said what was on his mind. Maybe they didn't say it out loud, like Ralph did, but they thought it. He was convinced that some of the problems his father had experienced could be traced directly to the residents of Crystal Lake. He wondered, as he went around town, picking up supplies, which of the people he encountered had been the ones who set the fires, which ones had vandalized the cabins and poisoned the wells. If there was any curse upon his family, he thought, it had been put there by some of the locals who didn't want to see the camp succeed. They were convinced it was an evil place, and they had suited their actions to their beliefs. It was a lot like a salesman who tried to sell a product he didn't believe in. Because he didn't believe in it, he didn't get behind it. And when the product, not surprisingly, didn't sell, he justified his own beliefs, his own failure, by saying, "See? It's just no good. I knew it all the time." Well, he wasn't going to fail with the camp. It was all he had. His legacy. His beginning. If he could make a go of it and turn it, sell it as a successful little business instead of a run-down piece of lakefront property that would be of little use to anyone except some businessmen from the city who wanted to use it as a hunting retreat, then he could make a profit on it. More importantly, he could establish himself as a real estate speculator who had taken a worthless piece of property and made something out of it. That was the sort of thing that banks would look favorably upon, and it would allow him to pyramid his investment, to get into something more ambitious, something he could build upon. You gotta start somewhere, he thought. You've gotta have a dream. Why couldn't Alice see that? Maybe he just couldn't compete with that guy out in California. Maybe that was it. Maybe all Alice wanted was a reason to go back to him, because he could offer her more, and she was using the camp as that reason. If that was the case, he couldn't fight it, and he wasn't going to try. Alice was old enough to know her own mind. She wasn't a child, and yet sometimes she acted like one. He'd start to reveal his plans, his dreams for a better future, and he'd see her shut him out. He didn't even want to hear it. He had thought that if she could see the place, if she could come out and see what he had done, actually participate in the project, then she might come to appreciate what he was trying to do. But no, she didn't really want to be there. She did her part, but her heart wasn't in it. She seemed to be one of those live-for-today types. Eat, drink, and be merry. For tomorrow, we die. If everybody thought that way, no one would ever accomplish anything. He had lingered in the town, partly because it had started raining and he wasn't anxious to drive back in the storm. He had been hoping it would let up. But at the same time, he wasn't looking forward to spending another night with Alice, with her trying to convince him it was all a pointless waste of time. She didn't see the potential of the place, its possibilities for success. She saw it as a romantic retreat, a place where, apparently, she had hoped she could get him to loosen up and not take life so seriously. They had each come to the camp with their individual goals in mind. He had hoped to get her interested in what he was trying to do, to get her involved so she could share his plans with him. She had hoped she could get him to walk along the lake shore and gaze up at the stars, stop and smell the roses. Only someone had to take the time to grow and tend the roses before anyone could smell them. Alice didn't seem to understand that, and obviously wouldn't try. He sighed and pushed away his coffee cup. Hell, what was the point? It just wasn't going anywhere. Neither of them was going to change. Maybe she would be better off going back to California. Maybe he'd be better off as well.
Steve,
said Sandy, coming over to him.
Is there anything else you want?
Oh, no. No thanks, Sandy. I'm fine.
You can't go back out there in that rain, she said. You want to get drowned?
No, but I've got to, Steve sighed. I've got 6 new counselors up at the camp. They are babes in the woods in every sense of the word.
Well, they'll be okay if they know enough to come out of the rain,
Sandy said, smiling. Mm-hmm. Well, what do I owe you? He reached for his wallet. Sandy smiled at him and winked from behind her harlequin glasses.
Just a night on the town, Steve?
He laughed. It was the same sort of comment she used to make when he was younger. It had made him feel important then, that an older woman would flirt with him like that. Now, it made him feel nostalgic for his youth.
Come on now, Sandy. You know what I mean.
She laughed.
Okay, 2.25.
He counted out 3 bills. She walked over to the antique cash register and rang it up.
Here's your change, Steve.
No, you keep it, Sandy.
Thank you.
Sure. He put on his slicker and headed for the door.
You drive careful now, she said.
I will.
Good night.
He put his hood up and ran to the Jeep, pausing briefly to check the trailer hitch before he got in out of the rain. Stupid, he thought. He should have done all this before the storm had started. Driving back from town with a loaded trailer on wet country roads at night was a good way to get into an accident. A Jeep was not the ideal vehicle to pull a trailer. It was too light, and its wheelbase was too short. He'd have to take it real easy. He wiped the inside of the windshield with his bare hand as he waited for the engine to warm up. Falling raindrops glistened in the glare of the headlights. They were probably all sitting around the fireplace in the main cabin, tearing through the beer supply and smoking pot, he grimaced. He'd have to make a point of warning them about that, With everything that was known about marijuana now, you had to be an idiot to smoke the stuff. He knew it didn't necessarily lead to harder drugs, but the effects of smoking it were even worse on the lungs than smoking cigarettes. He didn't want to see any of that sort of thing around the kids when they arrived, and he knew that Dorf would dearly love any excuse to make a surprise visit to the camp and search for drugs. All he needed was for Dorf to find a stash and bust one of the counselors. He'd have to bail the kids out. There'd probably be a lawsuit from the parents of the campers, and it would provide the town council with the perfect excuse to shut the camp down. Of course, Alice probably wouldn't see it that way. She'd tell him to lighten up. He sighed and shifted the Jeep into first gear. It gave a lurch as it strained against the weight of the trailer, and then slowly gathered speed. All he wanted right now was to climb into his cot and get a long night's sleep. Just forget about his problems and sink into the darkness.